I sent one photo to our family group chat. My son Micah was pale against the hospital pillow, 3 days after open-heart surgery that had a survival warning attached to the consent form. His IV line traced up his small arm, and his fingers were curled around the stuffed dinosaur he had insisted on bringing from home, the one with the torn ear he refused to let anyone fix. "He's asking for you," I wrote underneath the picture. My mother, Vivian, replied first. "We're swamped with gala prep. Can this wait?" Then my brother Preston added, "He's stable, right? Don't stress everyone out." I stared at those two sentences until the hospital room blurred around me. Then I typed back the only thing I had ever been trained to say to this family. "It's fine." I set the phone face down on the tray table beside Micah's water cup and turned my head toward the window so my 6-year-old would not see his mother crying. At 10 p.m. that night, something aired on the local CNN affiliate that made my entire family drop what they were holding. Stay with me, because what happened in that broadcast did not just expose one cruel text message. It cracked open a lie my family had been polishing for 20 years. If you believe that quiet people eventually get their reckoning, hit subscribe and follow this story all the way through, because you are not going to believe what my brother said on camera less than 2 hours after ignoring my son. My name is Renee Calloway. I was 32 years old, a widow, and the only parent Micah had left in any real sense. His father, Jonas, died in a highway collision 2 years earlier on his way home from a night shift, and since that day, every school form, every fever, every impossible decision had landed on my shoulders alone. I worked the front desk at St. Vincent Regional Medical Center. In the same hospital, my son now lay recovering, and I had spent enough years watching families fall apart in waiting rooms to think I understood grief from a safe distance. I did not understand what it meant to live inside it until it was my own child on the surgical schedule. My own hand shaking as I signed a form that listed cardiac arrest as a possible outcome of the procedure. Micah had been born with a heart defect the doctors called complex, a phrase that never once felt adequate for what it actually meant. For years, we managed it with medication, checkups, careful limits on how hard he could run at recess. Then, that spring, his lips started turning a faint shade of blue after even gentle activity, and the cardiologist's face changed in a way that told me before his mouth did. Surgery was no longer optional. It was scheduled within the month, a full repair that would either fix the damage for good or take my son from me on an operating table 3 floors above the front desk where I answered phones every day. I called my mother the night we got the surgery date. I hate admitting that even now, even after everything that followed, because some old instinct in me still reached for her, the way a child reaches for a parent's hand crossing a busy street. Vivian asked the right questions on the surface: which hospital, what time, and the surgeon's name. Then she said she would let the rest of the family know quietly so nobody felt overwhelmed, and I remember feeling something close to relief, thinking maybe this time she would show up the way a mother is supposed to. For 2 days after the operation, Micah stayed in the pediatric intensive care unit, tethered to monitors that beeped in a rhythm I had memorized by the second night. He slept through most of it, his small chest rising and falling under a blanket printed with cartoon rockets that a nurse had brought from the supply closet. When he did wake, he only had strength enough to squeeze 2 of my fingers before drifting off again. I sat in the vinyl chair beside his bed through every shift change, every quiet visit from Dr. Okafor, whispering the same 4 words over and over like a prayer I had invented myself. "I am right here." On the 3rd day, they moved him out of intensive care into a recovery room with softer lighting and a window that looked out over the hospital parking lot. Dr. Okafor said his numbers were trending in the right direction, that the hardest part of the physical recovery was likely behind him. I should have felt nothing but relief hearing that. Instead, I sat beside his bed with a different kind of ache pressing into my chest, because Micah kept turning his head toward the door every time it opened, hoping. "Is Grandma coming today?" he asked, his voice thin and scratchy from the breathing tube that had only recently come out. I smoothed the blanket over his legs and forced my mouth into something resembling a smile. I can text her, baby. And Uncle Preston? Does he still have my rocket toy he promised? The hope threaded through his small voice hurt worse than any accusation ever could have. Micah did not know that my mother had sent exactly one message since the surgery had even begun, a single line asking for updates that read more like a status report than a grandmother's concern. He did not know that Preston had responded to my earlier texts with a thumbs-up emoji and nothing else, 3 separate times. He was 6 years old, and he still believed with his whole heart that the adults who shared his blood would come running when he needed them. That was the belief I could not bring myself to correct, even as I opened the family group chat and stared at the last real conversation that had taken place there, 4 days earlier. It had nothing to do with Micah. It was my mother writing, "So proud of Preston. This gala is going to be everything," with 3 heart emojis attached, celebrating my brother's role as the featured host of that year's Hearts for Kids charity gala, a glossy fundraiser he had been building his name around for over a year. I looked from that message to my son's pale face on the pillow, and the irony sat in my stomach like a stone. A gala for children's hearts, hosted by a man who could not spare 2 minutes to check on his own nephew's heart. I took the photo carefully, angling it so it showed Micah's face and his small hand resting on his dinosaur. Nothing more clinical, nothing designed to look worse than it was. I did not want sympathy. I wanted them to see him, alive, tired, waiting. "He's asking for you," I typed, and hit send before I could talk myself out of it. I told myself there had to be a line even my family would not cross, that surely a 6-year-old fresh out of open-heart surgery was that line. I was about to learn exactly how wrong I had been for my entire life, and I was about to learn it in front of a camera crew that had already, without my knowledge, begun setting up in the hallway just outside my son's door. To understand why my mother's message hurt in a place deeper than anger, you have to understand what kind of family I grew up in. People like Vivian Calloway do not become cold all at once. They teach you slowly, over years, in ways so small you almost cannot point to any single moment and call it cruelty. A forgotten school play here, a promise broken there, a look across the dinner table that told you, without a single word, that your feelings were an inconvenience nobody had budgeted time for. By the time you are grown, you have already learned to lower your expectations before anyone else has to ask you to. Preston was 3 years older than me, and in our house that gap somehow made him both the firstborn and the only child who ever seemed to fully exist. When he brought home a C in algebra, my mother said the teacher clearly did not understand his leadership potential. When I brought home straight A's the same semester, she told me not to make a spectacle of it at dinner, because it would embarrass him. When Preston quit the travel baseball team after my parents had spent thousands of dollars on equipment and tournament fees, my father called it him finding his true path. When I asked, at 15, for $40 to cover a college prep exam fee, my mother asked why I could not aim for something more affordable than my dreams. I used to believe I was simply jealous of my brother, a bitter younger sister keeping score out of spite. That was what Vivian told me whenever I so much as pointed out the difference in how we were treated. She said it with such calm certainty that I eventually stopped pointing it out at all and started trying something else instead. I made myself useful. I remembered every birthday. I helped clean up after every family dinner without being asked. I answered the phone whenever my mother needed someone to listen to her complain about her sister, or her neighbors, or the price of everything. I showed up for every milestone of Preston's life, even the small ones, even when he could not be bothered to remember mine. I told myself, somewhere deep down, that if I could just be easy enough to love, eventually they would love me the way they loved him. Then I met Jonas in my early 20s, and for a while I let myself believe things might finally shift. He was quiet and steady, in a way that felt like standing on solid ground for the first time in my life, and when Micah was born, Jonas held him like he had been handed something made of glass and starlight. My parents came to the hospital that day with a balloon bouquet and took the obligatory photos, calling themselves proud grandparents in front of the nurses. For a few weeks after that, I let myself believe we had turned some invisible corner as a family, that a new baby had softened something in them, permanently. The corner disappeared the night Jonas did not come home. He was driving back from a night shift at the warehouse when another driver ran a red light on Tunnel Road, and by the time I understood what the police officer standing on my porch was actually telling me, my whole life had already been rearranged without my permission. I remember sitting at my kitchen table 2 days later with a stack of paperwork I did not understand, insurance forms, a funeral home brochure, Micah asleep on the couch after crying for his father until his little voice went hoarse. My mother came over for exactly 1 hour. She folded 2 dish towels, glanced around at the mess of grief scattered through my house, and said, "You're going to have to be strong now. You have a child depending on you." As though I had somehow not already understood that in the worst possible way. Preston sent a sympathy card with his assistant's handwriting on the envelope instead of his own. My father called once, briefly, and told me not to let the grief affect my attendance record at work, as if that was the most pressing concern in the wreckage of my life. After the funeral, people stopped asking how I was doing at all. They started asking whether I had gone back to work yet. They asked whether Micah was sleeping through the night. Practical questions. All of them, because practical questions did not require anyone to actually sit with my pain and hold it alongside me. So I built a life that did not need them. At least that is what I told myself every night I lay awake doing math in my head, stretching a receptionist's paycheck across rent, daycare, and a growing pile of medical bills once Micah's heart condition was diagnosed at 18 months old. His symptoms did not look dramatic in the beginning. Occasional fatigue during play. A faint tiredness that came and went. Doctors who said we should monitor it closely for now. Then came more appointments, more specialists, more tests, until finally a cardiologist sat across from me with a folder in her hands and used the word surgery for the first time, and the entire exam room seemed to tilt sideways under my feet. When it became clear the operation could not wait any longer, I called my mother before I called anyone else, and I still hate myself a little for that instinct, for how deeply trained I remained even after everything, to reach first for the person who was supposed to be my safety net and had never once actually been one. Vivian sounded appropriately concerned on the phone that day. She asked which hospital, what date, what the surgeon's name was, all the correct questions in the correct tone. Then she said she would quietly let the rest of the family know, because family should rally around family in moments like this. A week later, my Aunt Carol mentioned in passing that she had sent some money to my mother to help with Micah's medical expenses. A cousin said something similar. A woman from my father's church group told me their prayer circle had taken up a collection. I asked my mother about it once, carefully, not wanting to sound ungrateful. She told me the donations were being gathered and organized properly, so there would be no confusion later, that she was keeping careful track of everything and would hand it all over once the final bills came in. I was too exhausted from hospital visits and worry to push further. I wanted to believe her, because disbelief would have cost me energy I simply did not have left to spend. The hospital bills kept arriving regardless, stacking up on my kitchen counter in their thin white envelopes, and I kept paying what I could and delaying what I could not, never once seeing $1 of that promised help arrive. That was why my mother's message beside Micah's hospital bed cut somewhere so much deeper than simple anger could reach. It was not only cruel, it was, without her realizing it, a confession. Micah had never once been a grandson to Vivian when love required something from her. He had only ever been a story worth telling, a way to appear generous and devoted to friends and church groups, useful right up until the exact moment love would have cost her something real, like 2 hours of her time, or her presence at his bedside, or a single visit that could not be photographed for anyone to admire. Micah stirred in his sleep and made a small sound, half whimper, half sigh, and I leaned closer to the bed before I had even finished the thought. "Mommy," he whispered, eyes still closed. "I'm right here, baby." Did Grandma text back? I looked at his face, so pale against the pillow, and felt the truth pressing against the back of my teeth like it wanted out. I could not tell him what my mother had written, not then, not while his body was still fighting its way back to strength. She knows you're asking for her, I said carefully. Micah watched me with tired, half-open eyes. Is she mad because I got sick? My heart twisted so sharply I nearly lost my breath. No, sweetheart. You did absolutely nothing wrong. Then why doesn't she come? There are questions children ask that should embarrass every adult within hearing distance. I brushed a strand of hair away from his forehead, careful to avoid the faint bruise left by the surgical tape near his temple, and said the only true thing I had left to offer him. Sometimes grown-ups make choices that don't have anything to do with how much you're loved. By you, though, he whispered. Yes, always by me. He closed his eyes again, but the words stayed hanging in the room long after he drifted off. By me. Not by us. Not by them. By me. A little before 6 that evening, a nurse named Deb came in to check his vitals and swap out his IV bag. She had been assigned to us since the day he was moved out of intensive care, and she had a way of reading a room without asking too many invasive questions. She glanced at the empty visitor chair beside the bed, then at my face, and something in her expression told me she understood more in that single pause than my own family had managed to understand across 4 days. How's our tough guy doing? She asked Micah gently. My grandma might come, he mumbled, half asleep. Deb's eyes flicked to me for a fraction of a second. She'd be lucky to see how strong you've been, she said, and Micah smiled faintly before sinking back into sleep. Deb did not say anything else to me directly, but she squeezed my shoulder on her way out of the room, and that small gesture nearly undid me more than anything my mother had said all week. Around 6:30, I heard movement out in the hallway, unfamiliar voices, the low murmur of equipment being carried on a cart. A staff coordinator had mentioned earlier that a local news crew from the CNN affiliate would be filming some background footage that evening, a human interest segment tied to that year's Hearts for Kids Gala, which St. Vincent Regional had partnered with as one of its beneficiary programs. I had barely registered the information when it was mentioned at the front desk earlier in the week. My entire world had narrowed down to Micah's oxygen levels, his pain scores, and the exact minute the next doctor was scheduled to check in. Then a woman appeared in the doorway of the recovery room, and I recognized her instantly from the 10 o'clock broadcasts I sometimes half-watched while folding laundry. Renata Cole. She knocked softly on the open doorframe before stepping in. Mrs. Calloway? I'm sorry to bother you. Renee is fine, I said, straightening in my chair. She gave a respectful nod. Renee, we're filming a short segment tonight, tied to the Hearts for Kids Gala, following a few recovery stories from families this hospital has supported. Your nurse mentioned your son just came through a major heart surgery. We would only film with your full permission, and only if you're comfortable. I almost said no on reflex. I had spent my entire life protecting my family from consequences, shrinking myself and my problems so nobody else would have to feel uncomfortable, and even after everything, some tired, well-trained part of me still wanted privacy over anything that might cause a scene. Then Micah stirred, and his eyes drifted open just enough to notice the small camera bag slung over the cameraman's shoulder in the hallway behind her. Is that TV? He whispered, voice cracked and curious. Renata smiled gently at him. Only if your mom says it's okay, buddy. Micah looked at me, something hopeful flickering across his exhausted face. Maybe Grandma will see it. That single sentence settled heavily in the room between us. He did not want attention. He did not want strangers feeling sorry for him. He wanted the people who had already looked away from him once to somehow remember he still existed. I sat down on the edge of the bed and took his small hand in mine. Do you want to say something, buddy? He nodded weakly. I looked up at Renata. You can film him, but let him speak for himself. Nothing scripted. The camera light clicked on, warm and steady, and Renata kept her voice soft, asking Micah what he was most looking forward to, now that the hardest part of his surgery was behind him. His eyes drifted toward the empty visitor chair beside the bed, before he answered. "I just wanted my grandma to come," he said quietly, his voice barely rising above the hum of the monitor beside him. Nobody in that room spoke for several seconds. From somewhere down the hallway, I heard the murmur of a television at the nurse's station, and beneath it, unmistakably, my brother's voice, smooth and rehearsed, drifting from live gala coverage already airing on a different channel entirely. No child should ever have to face a hospital alone. I looked at my son's small hospital bracelet, then at my phone still resting on the tray table, the family group chat glowing faintly on the dark screen beneath it. By 10 o'clock that night, the whole city was going to see the truth laid bare, side by side, no editing required. And for the first time in my entire life, I understood with total clarity that I was not going to protect my family from the consequences of the choice they had already made. After Renata and the camera operator stepped back into the hallway to review their footage, the room felt strangely quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in on your ears after something loud has just stopped. Micah had drifted off again, his small face turned toward the empty visitor chair, as though some part of him still expected someone to walk through the door before he fully closed his eyes. I kept my hand over his and listened to the soft, steady rhythm of the monitor beside the bed, and I let myself sit there a moment longer, not thinking about anything, just breathing. A few minutes later, Renata knocked again, gentler this time, and stepped just inside the doorway with a folder of paperwork tucked under her arm. "Renee, I want to be completely transparent with you before we go any further," she said, keeping her voice low so it would not wake Micah. "If you decide to let us use tonight's footage, people in this town are going to figure out who your family is fairly quickly. We can avoid using last names on air, but the meaning behind everything will still be obvious once it airs." I looked over at the visitor chair, still empty, still untouched since the moment my son had first been wheeled into this room. "They wrote those messages assuming nobody would ever see them," I said quietly. "I want people to see them." Renata did not rush me. She handed me a release form and walked through every line of it out loud, explaining exactly what could and could not be included. No private medical charts, no footage without my direct sign-off, no names used in full unless I explicitly approved it. Only Micah's brief interview, a still shot of the empty chair, and whatever messages I chose to willingly share myself. I read every word twice before signing. I was exhausted down to my bones, but I was not going to let carelessness undo what little control I had left over my own son's story. While I signed the form, the television down at the nurse's station grew louder. Someone had turned up the volume on the early live coverage of the gala, and I heard applause ripple through the speaker before a familiar voice cut through it clearly. Preston's voice. I stepped just outside the doorway to see the screen at the end of the hall, and there he was, polished under warm stage lighting in a charcoal suit, standing beneath a gold banner that read, "Hearts for Kids Gala" in elegant script. Behind him, donors in evening wear clinked glasses at white linen tables, and near the front of the crowd stood my mother, dressed in pearls, wearing the same proud expression she had only ever reserved for him. A reporter on stage asked Preston why this particular cause mattered so deeply to him. He pressed one hand flat over his heart, the gesture practiced and smooth. "No child should ever have to face illness without their family right there beside them," he said, and the crowd applauded warmly, as though he had said something original, instead of something that should have made him choke on the words. For a moment, the hallway seemed to tilt beneath my feet. Less than 2 hours earlier, this same man had told me he was busy and to simply handle it myself. My mother had called my son a problem I was making the family carry, and now they were standing under gold lighting, accepting warm applause for caring about children exactly like mine. Renata came to stand beside me and looked from the television screen to Micah's closed door, then back to me. She did not say anything, because she did not need to. The contradiction was sitting right there in plain sight, glowing under stage lights on one channel, while my son slept alone in a hospital bed just down the hall. My phone buzzed once in my pocket, and for a foolish half-second I thought perhaps my mother had reconsidered. That guilt had finally caught up with her. It was my father instead. "Your mother says you're upset. Tonight is important for your brother. Please don't cause a scene." I stared at that message for a long moment. My father had always been quiet, and for most of my life I had mistaken that silence for a kind of gentleness. I understood now, standing in that hallway, that silence beside cruelty is not kindness at all. It is permission. Renata glanced at my phone screen without meaning to intrude. "Do you want that included too?" she asked softly. I shook my head. "Not tonight. I don't want this to become every single thing I've ever carried from this family. I just want people to see what happened to Micah." She nodded. No argument. No pressure. Inside the room, Micah stirred and opened his eyes halfway. "Mommy," he whispered, "did I do okay on the camera?" I moved back to his bedside and took his hand again. "You did wonderfully, baby. Will Grandma see it?" I could not promise him that outcome, but I could give him something true instead. "Maybe," I said. "But what matters most is that you told the truth." His eyes drifted toward the empty chair one more time. "I didn't say anything mean." "No, sweetheart, you didn't. You never have to. I just wanted her here." I kissed his forehead and swallowed hard against the ache rising in my chest. "I know, baby. I know." At 8:30, Renata returned once more to confirm the segment would run at the top of the 10 o'clock broadcast. It would open with Preston's remarks from the stage, then transition to Micah's short clip from his hospital bed, and finally close with the screenshots of the messages I had agreed to share, names blurred but words untouched. "Your family will most likely call the moment this airs," Renata said gently. "They may accuse you of embarrassing them publicly." I looked down at Micah's hand resting inside mine. "They embarrassed themselves," I said. "I only stopped hiding it for them." After Renata left to prep her final cut, I opened the family group chat one last time before 10 o'clock arrived. No one had asked whether Micah was in pain. No one had asked whether I had eaten anything or slept in days. My mother had sent one final message instead. "I hope you aren't still sulking. Tonight matters a great deal to your brother." I almost typed back that Micah's night mattered a great deal too, that he had survived, that he had woken up asking for people who could not even be bothered to check whether he was still breathing. Instead, for the first time in my entire life, I let their own words sit there completely unanswered, and I turned on the small television mounted in the corner of Micah's room to wait for 10 o'clock to arrive. Preston looked toward the hallway where two nurses were pretending very hard not to listen to any of this. "This is exactly what I mean," he said, his voice dropping into something quieter but no less sharp. "Now everyone thinks we abandoned a sick child. You need to give a statement tomorrow. Tell Renata you were emotional, exhausted, that this family has always supported you." Deb's expression hardened slightly at the counter, but she stayed professional and said nothing. My father finally spoke from the doorway, his voice small. "Preston, not here." Preston turned on him instantly. "Then where, Dad? If this keeps spreading, I lose my seat on the foundation board. I could lose sponsors I've spent 2 years building relationships with." "That's what you're worried about," I said, and he looked back at me like the question itself offended him. "You made a private family matter public," he shot back. "No," I said. "You made a child's pain inconvenient. I only made it visible." My mother set the lilies down harder than necessary against the counter. "That's enough. You're angry, and you're punishing all of us for it. But when people ask, you are going to tell them this family has been helping you." I felt the old fear rise up in my chest, exactly the way it always had. The fear of being called dramatic, ungrateful, bitter. The fear of standing alone in a room against people who had spent decades rewriting any story to their own advantage, if given enough time to talk. Then Dr. Okafor stepped through the doorway. She had changed out of her surgical scrubs hours earlier, but her eyes still carried the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent the day fighting for other people's children. She looked from me to my family, then to Micah, sleeping again with his hand still curled around mine. Is everything all right in here? She asked evenly. My mother's demeanor shifted instantly, warming like a switch had been flipped. Doctor, thank goodness. We're his family. There's simply been a terrible misunderstanding. We've been very involved throughout all of this, of course. Dr. Okafor looked at me first, not her, and that single small choice steadied something inside my chest. Renee, she said. I answered plainly. They came after the news segment aired. They're asking me to say they've been supporting us. Dr. Okafor's expression did not change, but her voice cooled several degrees. I see. Preston attempted a smile that did not reach his eyes. Doctor, with respect, this is family tension, and the media has twisted something private. Dr. Okafor turned to face him directly. I can't speak to your family's private messages. I can speak to what I've personally observed over the past 4 days. Renee has been the only person present throughout Micah's surgery, his ICU stay, and his transfer into recovery. She signed every consent form, she sat through every risk conversation. She was here the moment he opened his eyes. Until tonight, I had not seen a single one of you. The room went completely silent. My mother's mouth opened, then closed again with nothing behind it. Preston looked as though someone had physically taken a script out of his hands mid-sentence. My father lowered his eyes to the floor and said nothing at all. Dr. Okafor continued in the same level voice. He needs rest, and stress isn't helpful to his recovery right now. If your presence is going to create distress for him, visiting hours can be limited accordingly. My mother's eyes turned sharp again, fixing directly on me. You would keep us from our own grandson. I looked down at Micah's sleeping face, and the answer came easier than I expected it to. I will keep anything from him that hurts him, I said. My mother recoiled slightly, as though I had physically struck her. Preston shook his head and muttered something under his breath that I did not bother trying to hear. I was finished trying to sound reasonable to people who had already decided, long before tonight, to misunderstand me on purpose. Deb stepped forward gently. I think he needs quiet now. For a long moment I thought my mother might refuse to leave entirely, standing her ground the way she always had at every dinner table and every family gathering for 30 years. Then she seemed to remember the nurses standing nearby, the doctor watching her carefully, the very real possibility of more witnesses seeing exactly who she was underneath the pearls, and the practiced concern. She picked her purse back up with stiff fingers. This family is not finished discussing this, she said. No, I answered quietly. But tonight, you're finished discussing it in my son's room. Preston left first, saying nothing further. My father followed slowly, and at the doorway he glanced back once at Micah, and for just a second I saw something that almost looked like shame cross his tired face. It was not enough. Shame without any action behind it had always been the native language of this family, spoken fluently by everyone except me. My mother was the last to leave, pausing to glance once more at the lilies still sitting on the counter. I brought those for him, she said. I looked at the white flowers, expensive and completely useless. Take them with you, I told her. He can't have strong scents in the room right now. That was not entirely true. The nurses could have simply moved them elsewhere, but I did not want one more symbol of my mother's performance lingering in that room a second longer than necessary. When the door finally clicked shut behind her, the silence that settled over the room felt different than before. Not empty, protected. Deb exhaled slowly. You okay? I sat back down beside Micah and took his hand again. Not yet, I admitted. Dr. Okafor nodded once before stepping out. That's an honest answer to give. A few minutes later, Micah stirred just enough to whisper, Did they leave? Yes, baby. Are you mad? I kissed his knuckles gently. Not at you. Never at you. He thought about that for a moment, his eyes still closed. I don't want Grandma's flowers. Something cracked open and warm in my chest despite everything. Then no Grandma flowers, I whispered, and he drifted back into sleep with a small, satisfied breath, while my phone buzzed again and again inside the drawer beside us, and for the first time in my life, I let their panic wait. By the time the sun came up the next morning, the story had already spread far beyond what I ever expected. I woke in the vinyl chair beside Micah's bed with a stiff neck, a cold cup of vending machine coffee on the tray, and 41 unread messages on my phone. Some were from relatives I barely remembered speaking to in years. A few were from neighbors who had seen Micah on the 10 o'clock news and wanted to know how they could help. I did not answer any of them right away. Micah was still asleep, and Dr. Okafor had made it clear that rest mattered more than anything else happening outside these four walls. His numbers had stayed steady overnight, his breathing had eased, and those small, quiet signs should have been the only things I cared about. But my phone kept lighting up in the drawer, and each buzz felt like another hand knocking on a door I had not yet decided to open. When he woke, Micah asked for apple juice, and then asked whether the television people were gone. I told him yes, and he looked visibly relieved. "Did Grandma get mad?" he asked. I helped him take a small sip through the bendy straw. "Grandma has some grown-up feelings to work through," I said carefully. He frowned. "Because I said I wanted her here?" "No, sweetheart, because sometimes the truth makes people feel uncomfortable, and that's not something you ever have to apologize for." He thought about that the way he thought about a school lesson he did not particularly like, then leaned back against his pillow and whispered, "I don't want to be on TV again." "You don't have to be," I told him. "Not unless you decide you want to." That was the first promise I made him that morning. The second one I made silently to myself. I would not let anyone use his pain for their own purposes ever again. Not my family, not the cameras, not anyone who wanted a sad story to feel righteous about for a few minutes, and then move on with their day. After breakfast, once Micah had drifted into a lighter, more restful sleep, I finally forced myself to open the messages waiting on my phone. Aunt Carol had sent 3 in a row. "Renee, I just saw the segment. I am so sorry. Your mother told all of us she was managing a fund for Micah's surgery costs. Please tell me the money actually reached you." I read that last line twice before scrolling further. My cousin Rachel had written that she and her husband sent $500 directly to my mother back in the spring, after Vivian told everyone that the surgery expenses were quietly crushing me. A woman from my father's church group said their small prayer circle had collected $1,200 for the same cause. One of Preston's business contacts sent an oddly formal message explaining he had personally contributed to the Hearts for Kids gala table because Vivian had described it to him privately as urgent support tied to her sick grandson. My hands went cold around the phone. I had known relatives had given something. I had heard bits and pieces of it in passing over the past several months, but every single time I had asked my mother about it directly, she said the same practiced line. She was keeping careful records, waiting for the right moment, making sure everything was handled properly so there would be no confusion about taxes later. I had been too exhausted from fighting insurance claims and sitting through appointments to demand more of an answer than that. I opened my email and searched for Micah's name. Nothing came up. No spreadsheet, no receipts, no accounting of any kind from my mother. Then I searched through her old text messages instead, and month after month of vague reassurance scrolled past on the screen. "We're collecting things carefully. Don't worry about that side of it. Preston knows people who can help. Let me handle this so you can focus on Micah." At the time, those messages had felt like support. Now they looked exactly like what they were, a curtain drawn across something she never intended to let me see. My phone rang before I could think much further. It was Renata. I stepped just outside the doorway, keeping Micah within view through the small window. "I'm not putting him back on camera," I said, before she could even greet me. "I wouldn't ask you to," she answered. "I'm calling to check on both of you, and to warn you, people are starting to ask questions about a family fund online. A few viewers have publicly said they donated through your mother." My stomach tightened. "You know about that already?" "Only what people are volunteering publicly in the comments. I haven't used any of it, and I won't report a single word unless you decide to speak on it and can back it up with something solid." That mattered more than she probably realized. Renata was not digging through my family's private business or chasing gossip for a headline. She was waiting for proof I suddenly understood I might already be holding in my own two hands. "I need a little time," I told her. "Take it," she said. "And Renee, be careful. Once money becomes part of this story, your family is going to panic a lot harder than they already have." She was right. The first call came from Preston, 6 minutes later. I let it go to voicemail. Then my mother called. Then my father. Then Preston again. I did not listen to a single one of them until after Micah had taken his afternoon medication and drifted off once more. Preston's voicemail was sharp and clipped, his breathing audible between sentences. "You don't understand how non-profit sponsorships work, and you could create serious problems for a lot of people if you keep going down this road. Call me before you say something you can't take back." My mother's voice, when I finally played hers, had gone cold and controlled. "Renee, you are letting strangers turn you against your own family. That money was never stolen. It was simply being handled. Do not start throwing accusations around because you're emotional." My father's message was the shortest of all three. "Your mother says this is getting out of control. Please, let's talk about this privately." Privately. That word again. The exact place where this family had always buried every uncomfortable truth for as long as I could remember. I sat with the phone resting in my lap and looked over at Micah, sleeping peacefully with one small hand resting open on the blanket, his IV taped carefully against the pale skin of his arm. People had sent that money believing it would help him. They had pictured hospital bills, medication, maybe a few quiet nights of rest for an exhausted single mother who never asked anyone for anything. Had a single dollar of it actually touched his care? I already knew the answer sitting somewhere heavy in my chest. I simply did not yet know exactly where all of it had gone, but I intended to find out. One screenshot, one receipt, one carefully saved message at a time, and this time I was not going to let my mother talk her way around a single piece of it. The proof I needed arrived through Aunt Carol 2 days later, and it landed harder than I expected. She forwarded me an email my mother had sent months earlier, one I had never seen before, sent quietly to relatives and church friends while I was still sitting through cardiology appointments, not yet knowing surgery would even be necessary. The subject line alone made my stomach turn. For Micah, family steps up when it matters most. Inside, my mother had written about his condition in soft, tragic language, describing me as too proud to ever ask for help myself. She wrote that the family had a responsibility to protect one of its youngest members, and at the bottom of the message she listed her own payment information, promising she would collect all the contributions carefully before sending one organized amount toward his surgery costs. Underneath that, Aunt Carol had attached her own payment confirmation, the memo line reading plainly, "Micah Medical Support." I covered my mouth with my hand and sat perfectly still for a long moment, the recovery suite shrinking around me. My mother had not simply failed to show up for my son. She had used his illness to collect money from people who loved him, and then let me sit alone beside his hospital bed, believing I had no support at all outside my own two hands. I searched Preston's name next, and buried inside a public article covering the Hearts for Kids gala from 2 weeks earlier, I found a donor list. Preston Calloway, Gold Table sponsor. No amount was listed publicly, but the timing alone made my skin crawl. My mother had been quietly collecting money for Micah's surgery during the same months Preston was building his public image around sick children on a stage under gold lighting. Marcus Webb, an attorney at the legal aid clinic Renata had connected me with, listened carefully as I laid the whole timeline out over the phone. He asked when the money had been collected, who had solicited it, what language had been used, and whether donors genuinely believed they were contributing toward Micah's medical expenses. I forwarded him the folder of screenshots while we spoke. When he finished reading through everything, he was quiet for several seconds. "This isn't something that gets resolved with a family apology," he said finally. "At minimum, donors were misled about where their money was going. Depending on the amounts involved and what we can establish about intent, this could rise to the level of fraud." I closed my eyes. Part of me had wanted him to tell me this was messy but ultimately harmless. That would have been easier. Painful but easier. Instead, the truth was growing teeth right in front of me. Preserve everything, Marcus told me. Don't delete a single message. Don't threaten them directly. I can help draft a formal demand for a full accounting. If they refuse to provide it, we escalate from there. That evening, I sent one message to the family group chat, carefully worded, nothing accusatory in the language itself. Please send a full accounting of every donation collected in Micah's name, including dates, amounts, donor names, and exactly where the money was spent. Preston replied first. Do not do this here. My mother followed immediately after. We will not be interrogated by you while you are clearly emotional. Then, after a long silence, my father finally wrote something that stayed on the screen, like a crack running straight through a wall. Vivian, send her the records if everything is in order. It was the first time in my entire life I had ever seen him challenge her in writing, even in something as small as that single sentence. By afternoon, Renata called again to tell me 2 more donors had reached out to her directly, saying they had contributed to a fund for Micah and wanted to know what had actually happened to it. I told them I can't report anything without documents and without your consent, she said. But Renee, this is starting to become a second story on its own. I looked through the small window at Micah, sitting up in bed watching cartoons with the volume turned low, smiling faintly at something on the screen, the first almost normal expression I had seen on his face in days. I want him left out of it as much as possible from here forward, I told her. No new footage of him, nothing that uses his pain for drama. Then we focus entirely on the records, she said. The fundraiser language, the donor claims, the gala sponsorship. We don't need to show him again. That was exactly why I trusted her. That night, Marcus sent a formal demand for accounting to both my mother and Preston through their newly hired attorney, requesting records of every dollar raised in Micah's name. The response came the next morning, claiming all donations had been given voluntarily to a family support effort, and that spending decisions were left entirely to my mother's discretion. Marcus was not shaken by it. The donor messages and memo lines are a serious problem for her, he explained. Most of them explicitly mention Micah's medical expenses. The gala memo listing his name creates a direct link they're going to struggle to explain away. Within days, the district attorney's office confirmed they had received several complaints and were opening a preliminary inquiry. The hospital foundation announced Preston had been suspended from all donor-facing roles pending review. His company issued a short, carefully worded statement saying he was taking an extended personal leave. Nobody believed for a second that it was his own decision. My mother stepped down from her position on her church's charity committee before they could remove her formally themselves. Her attorney's carefully drafted letters could not undo the plain truth sitting in black and white across dozens of donor screenshots. And through it all, my father sent me one final message I read twice before setting the phone down. I should have asked more questions. I did not know about the gala memo until yesterday. It was not an apology. Not fully, not yet. But it was the first sentence he had ever sent me that was not asking me to make things easier for everyone else in this family. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, that small crack felt like something real beginning to open. Micah was discharged 11 days later, on a bright, ordinary Tuesday morning, and when a nurse wheeled him toward the exit with his stuffed dinosaur balanced in his lap, several of the staff who had cared for him lined the hallway to clap softly as we passed. Dr. Okafor crouched down to his level one last time and told him to follow every single instruction his cardiologist gave him from here on, even the boring ones. Micah promised solemnly that he would, then leaned over and whispered to me that boring instructions were still better than scary ones. I laughed for the first time in what felt like weeks, and the sound surprised even me. The weeks that followed moved forward without me having to push very hard. Marcus told me the civil claim had been filed and that the district attorney's office had formally requested records from several donors. My father had voluntarily handed over bank statements showing transfers out of my mother's account, around the exact time Preston's gala table had been purchased, a small but undeniable thread connecting everything together. Preston's company made his leave permanent, rather than temporary, quietly scrubbing his name from their community partnerships page. The Hearts for Kids Foundation removed him from their donor recognition list entirely. My mother's church issued a formal apology to every donor who had believed their contribution was going directly toward Micah's medical care. Eventually, faced with everything Marcus had assembled, their attorney offered a full settlement, returning every dollar collected in Micah's name, along with additional funds to cover legal fees and documented medical expenses. It was not generosity. It was panic wearing the calm language of a legal document, and I accepted it exactly as it was. My mother tried one final time to reach me, showing up alone at the recovery suite, a week before discharge, without Preston beside her, without the pearls arranged quite as carefully. Security eventually had to ask her to leave the front desk area after she refused to lower her voice, but not before she managed to say the one thing I think she truly believed. "You have taken everything from me." I looked at her for a long moment, thinking of the empty chair, of Micah asking why she was mad at him for getting sick, of months spent choosing which bill could wait another cycle, while she quietly gathered checks with his name written across the memo line. "No," I told her. "I stopped giving you my silence. That's all I actually took. I did not raise my voice saying it. I did not need to anymore." My father visited twice more after that, both times with Micah's permission first, and both times he came without flowers, bringing instead small, quiet things: a puzzle book, a soft blanket printed with cartoon stars. He sat carefully in the visitor chair, the one that had sat empty for so many days, and Micah studied him for a long moment before asking the only question that mattered. "Are you really sorry?" I almost stepped in to soften it for him, the way I always had for everyone else in this family, and then I stopped myself, because it was Micah's question to ask, and Micah's answer to receive. "Yes," my father said, his eyes filling. "I'm sorry I didn't come when you needed us." Micah considered that with the serious face he only wore when something mattered. "Mommy says sorry means you do better next time." "Your mommy is right," my father whispered, and I understood in that small exchange that this was not forgiveness, not yet, and maybe not ever fully. It was only a beginning, and I had learned by then never to confuse the two. 3 months later, Micah returned to school part-time, his color fuller, his laugh coming easier, though some nights he still woke from dreams about hospital hallways, and I would sit beside his bed until his breathing evened out again. Healing, I learned, was never a straight road. It was a hallway with flickering lights and doors that opened slowly, some days measured in nothing bigger than simply getting out of bed. I used part of the settlement to set up a properly managed medical account through Marcus's office, every donor receiving a formal receipt and a genuine thank you, several writing back with apologies of their own. And with what remained, I started something small, a fund we ended up calling Micah's Corner, providing meal cards, parking passes, and small comfort bags for parents forced to sit alone beside a hospitalized child with nowhere else to turn. The first time we delivered care bags to the pediatric floor together, Micah insisted on carrying the bag full of stuffed animals himself, still moving carefully but proudly, and he handed a small plush rabbit to a little boy waiting nervously for tests of his own. On our way out, he slipped his hand into mine and asked quietly, "Is this because Grandma didn't come?" I looked down at him. "Partly," I admitted. "And because other kids need someone to show up for them too. That part matters more," he said, and I felt something settle firmly into place inside my chest, something that finally resembled peace instead of grief. That evening, back at our apartment, my phone lit up once with a message from an unfamiliar number. "Can we see him someday?" I did not need to guess who it was. New number. Same old belief that simply wanting access again was the same thing as having earned it. Micah looked up from his coloring book at the kitchen table. "Who is it?" "No one we need tonight, baby." He nodded and went back to filling in a crooked blue rooftop with careful strokes of color, and I deleted the message without a second thought. Maybe someday there would be a real conversation. Maybe there never would be, and I had made peace with either outcome. For most of my life, I believed family meant the people you were required to forgive, simply because they shared your name. I know better now. Family is who shows up when showing up actually costs them something. Family never once makes a child feel like a burden for needing love. And as I carried Micah to bed that night, his arms looped loosely around my neck, laughing at something small and ordinary, I did not feel like I had lost my family at all. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt like I had finally found my way home.